Ah, Mr.
Hey,
Henry, how are you?
good. How are you?
I'm doing great. So, to the Tiny Bookstore community, this is the author, Andre Henry. His first book, All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep, just came out this past Tuesday. If you haven't ordered it, I think that you should. I think that it's a very educational book. It's inspiring, but it also felt like therapy to me in a good way.
Good.
So, if I can call you Andre?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Of course. Um, I am a musician. I grew up in Stone Mountain, Georgia, in a home of Jamaican immigrants. My folks are from Jamaica, and my grandmother was deeply involved in church, and so she took me and my brother when we were young, and I got very deeply involved in the life of the church, which is where I met a lot of the people that I'm writing about in the book. Uh, yeah, I guess that's a bit of my background.
Okay, awesome. So I'd like to just get right into it because
Let's
as I
go.
was reading through it, like I think that a lot of people are all about, being right or being wrong as far as their perspectives. The way that I prefer to see it is that we're all on journeys.
Hmm.
And your journey resonated with me a lot. I grew up Southern Baptist,
Okay.
in a primarily white middle class to upper class area.
Hmm.
So as I'm going through, it's just like a lot of like, I'm not saying that I completely agree with everything, but it was just so unbelievably on point. Now, I know that some people are taking one look at this title and just being like, okay, wait, what does he mean by all the white friends I can't keep? And if you can explain that title, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I know what it meant to me, but what did that title mean for you?
Well, the title comes from an open letter that I wrote to the white friends I couldn't keep in 2019. Because the relationships that I described, these were deep relationships that I had. These were good friends. These are people I considered family. And some of them had been online saying things like, Andre's a racist, Andre hates white people, and things like that. And so I said, you can't go around saying things like that without a receipt. Show me the tweet or the text message or the blog post or whatever where I ever said that I hate white people. And so I wrote them an open letter as a receipt of my love to them to say that the thing that has separated us is not hatred for white people. It is um, your refusal to show up for someone that you claim that you love, and it is your yeah, that they were unwilling, to do that. They were unwilling to listen. They were unwilling to look into these matters for themselves. And so a literary agent approached me and felt like that a book could be written from that blog. So the title pretty much stayed the same, except for I decided that I didn't want to address the book to the same people. So we just dropped the preposition. We just dropped the to all the white friends and just made it all the white friends that I couldn't keep, because I still recount those relationships, but to draw messages about movement building from them.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that your particular approach, your perspective, it's if, and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I know that you mentioned, militant doesn't necessarily mean violent, that your approach is nonviolent.
Hmm.
Now, and I think that that's in a lot of ways it's brilliant because a lot of times when people think that in order for us to have progress that we just kind of have to hold hands and sing kumbaya and that we have to keep it peaceful. So if you could talk about your perspective about like why it's important to be militant and nonviolent and racial progress.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that question. It's such a important question for this book, because that is really why I wrote the book, was because I got tired of seeing people like us dying online and on TV. And I felt like, well, I want to be a part of, moving this forward. I have to invest my body in this. And so I started studying freedom movements of the past and speaking with practitioners of nonviolent movements around the world, you know, people who have led revolutions in other countries and things like that. And I found that this is something Dr. King was talking about often. You know, Dr. King often uses militant language. He called in his speech at the March on Washington, he calls the civil rights movement a marvelous new militarism or militancy that they had found. Sorry, militancy, not militarism. That's Dr. King was against militarism.
Yes.
But
Yes.
um, so anyway, I find that for many people, when you talk about nonviolence, they think of it as just this kind of abstract, philosophical position that they hold, rather than a method of struggle,
Yes.
right? Which is how Dr. King and many others were thinking of and talking about it and executing it as a method of struggle. And the militant part comes in where people actually did, and throughout the years, military strategy has actually been appropriated into many of successful nonviolent movements and nonviolent campaigns. And the I want to just talk about a couple of those aspects so that people can really be clear about it. So, nonviolent struggle or civil resistance, whatever you want to call it, can be militant in the sense that it is organized, it incorporates strategy, it takes the initiative, you know, and it actively seeks conflict, you know, without causing harm to, you know, your opponent,
Right.
you know. And so this is something that nonviolent practitioners have been saying and studying and executing for years, and I believe that that is the missing component to many of our movements today, because I've been a part of, you know, a lot of movement activity, and oftentimes people don't want to strategize. They don't want to make plans. They don't want to assess the situation or really get a deep understanding of the system that they're coming up against. And these are all things that are part of a militant approach, because you would never go into, many people call nonviolence war without weapons. You would never go into battle without a plan. You would never go into battle without understanding, without a deep understanding of the conflict situation.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that what a lot of people tend to do is they conflate the entire idea of nonviolent activity with being passive.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that that really gets to the core of what you're bringing out, is that, you know, it's one thing to just kind of sit back and let things happen to and accept things the way they are. It's
Right.
another to say, okay, this is enough. We're going to get progress. You know,
Hmm.
we're going to do it without violence, without harm, but
Yeah.
we're not just going to stay where we are. We're going to move
Exactly.
forward. And again, I just love that difference between like violent action, nonviolent action, and just being passive.
Exactly. Exactly. I love that you bring that up, because that is exactly it. Like, I remember talking with someone while I was writing the book and them saying, well, we've already tried nonviolent action. And I was like, okay, explain, you know? And they weren't talking about the civil rights movement. They were talking about just people doing nothing.
Right. I hashtagged it. That should have worked. So yeah, like it, again, it's, and again, what I really do love about what you've done is that you're also describing the obstacles that people are running into as far as, you know, the majority.
Hmm.
Martin Luther King Jr. talked about how the greatest danger, they're not the violent and the racists, it's the people who are just, they're liberal, they're moderate, and they're just saying, okay, just calm down. They're uncomfortable with the
Yes.
conversations. Now, I
Hmm.
know that some of the blowback that I've seen that you're getting online is that people are accusing you of being racist,
Yeah.
separatist, you know, militant in a bad way. And I think that as I was reading it, an issue of self-preservation,
Oh, yes. Absolutely. Yes.
that it's the experiences that you had, it's all about there's an expectation that you need to maintain the comfort of the people around you,
Hmm.
whether that's by being silent or silenced, but you know, just don't bring up these things that are bothering you in order to make other people comfortable. If you could talk to us a little bit more about, about that.
Yes, absolutely. I think that we're dealing with a widespread false theory of change in our society
Hmm.
that says, like you mentioned earlier, like all we need to do is get together, hold hands, and sing kumbaya, or come to the table and talk about our quote unquote differences.
Right.
And I'm not saying that, there's no place for singing kumbaya with people or, you know, coming to the table and talking about differences if that's what you want to do. But what I'm talking about is a political intervention against the flow of anti black power.
Yes.
And in order for one, or sorry, a movement for a people to execute a successful intervention against the flow of anti-black power, this violent power, um, that those strategies aren't going to work. Just to put it bluntly, that's just not enough.
Right.
And so when people are on the misconception that I talked about, they think that the point is for us to just be together, not realizing that if we're together and those people who are entrenched in that anti-black common sense and those habits, that is an invitation for us to experience violence. You know,
Right.
it's an environment of harm for us. First off, so they have work to do in order for us to be together if that's what they want, right?
Yes.
And on top of that, us just being together will not stop, the rate at which black people are being killed by the police, the rate at which black people are being denied housing. It will not close the racial wealth gap, all those kinds of things. Those kinds of things require, you know, strategic planning and strategic interventions. And I say all that to say that it's like people who say those kinds of things, like, and I know it's not just me they say those things about. I am just a type standing in for all the other black people who go through these kinds of journeys.
Hmm.
Um, they're missing the point. The point is we have work to do. And I'm only interested in right now the most important type of unity is the type of unity that is built among people who want to do that work together.
Yes.
If you're not interested in doing that work, then, why should I be interested in talking to you right now? I don't understand.
No, absolutely. And I think that the point that you're making, it's very interesting. I know that one of the main themes and one of the main goals of the civil rights movement is equality, because there was an issue with separate and unequal. And
Hmm.
I think that a lot of people tend to assume that once you solve the separate, that the equality is just going to naturally happen. And what we've seen over the last, 400 something years is that it's it's not that.
Yeah,
We have together, but still disparate treatment, and we know who is not being treated as well.
there we go.
So, yeah, I think that that's really getting at that lack of equality, that unequal prong of it. So
Yeah,
it's being together is great, but we want to be together and equal. Let's not forget
right,
that other side of it.
right. And I also feel like, and this has happened throughout our history, where people love to criticize the response of black people to anti-black violence, why, and continue to erase, you know, the the stimulus, right? So like if black people say, okay, because the accusation of me being a separatist, that's an interesting one, right? Because I've never said that, right? I've never argued for a black ethno state. But if I did, but if I had, could you blame me? So right now I'm sitting across from a women's center, right? This is a women's club behind me, actually. And this club was established in the mid 20th century, right? Now, can someone look at this building and say these women are separatists, considering the historical context of what women's lives were like in 1940 something, 1950 something? It doesn't make any sense. So that's what I mean. People love to erase that, and we continue to erase the violence of this society and the violence that built and structures this society, and criticize, those who are trying to figure out how to free themselves from it.
Yes. And I think that again, the just reading the words and knowing that, okay, it's not just me that's seeing this, it's not just my family and my friends, that it's a little, unfortunately, it's a little bit of a universal, okay, I don't want to say universal, but it's the majority experience for minorities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that's where, like I said, the therapy part of it, just, I think that there's a little bit of self care involved here in
Mm.
being able to sit here and say, okay, if you have someone who's not acknowledging that anti Blackness exists and that it's something that is harming you,
Yes.
you don't have that obligation to hold their hands and to try to lead them to wisdom.
Yes.
It is okay for you to leave these people alone.
Yes. Yes.
And at first, like, my natural instinct is to bring people together and to just say, like, we have to find a way to reach people.
Yes.
But I think that one of the things that you touched upon is the cost to the person who's trying to do that unification. If you can
Yes.
talk about that a little bit.
Yes. I mean, I agree so much with what you're saying. It resonates with me so much, because that is often what people are asking. I feel like people are asking Black people to shoulder the burden of unification, you know, and they they don't understand what, like you said, the cost of that. The cost mentally, and
Mm-hmm.
and it's not just mental, right? Because our bodies are connected, right? So it has somatic effects, the kind of stress, that your body is enduring going through those things. And so there are a couple things that I think about that. One is another misconception that many people have, right? If we're going to fix this thing, we need everybody to get on board. We have to have everybody. And so that means that you have to constantly take every opportunity, every person who's wrong about racism, everybody who says a racist thing, everybody who, commits some kind of microaggression against you. You have to be the patient teacher and educate them and change them, convert them to being
Right.
anti-racist. We don't need everybody. We need 3.5% of the population in sustained, active, nonviolent struggle, right? Or somewhere around there. That we can't say 3.5% is the magic number, but the statistics shows that no regime has been able to withstand 3.5% of the of any population in sustained nonviolent struggle. So what we know is that we need a minority. The other misconception that's stacked on top of the we need everybody is that there are only two kinds of people. There are people who are adamantly for the cause, and there are people who are adamantly against. And so they want for us to go to the worst offenders and change the
Right.
worst offenders, right? And it was very liberating to me to come to learn from seasoned nonviolence practitioners, revolutionaries, that no, it's a spectrum, right? There are people who are against but not actively against. There are people who feel neutral on the issue. They don't feel like they have enough information, so they're not going one way or the other. There are people who say that they agree with you but they're not doing anything, and you'll have a much easier time moving the people who say that they are with you but not doing anything than trying to get Richard Spencer to become an anti-racist.
Yep. Absolutely. It's basically a method of reaching the people who are willing to be reached. And
Yeah.
that's not and another thing that I love is that you're not saying that people should be doing anything. You
Yeah.
are offering a particular path that people can
Yeah.
take. And if people want to go and reach out to the Richard Spencers of the world and try to bring them over, hey, be aware that these are the obstacles you're going to run into. But it's
Yes.
okay to reach the people who are actually reachable. And if you want progress, it's not necessarily the most efficient or effective thing to try to reach those other people. So if you could talk about that a little bit,
Yeah.
how trying to reach the unreachables can be an obstacle.
Well, this is what I mentioned in the first, I think the introduction, where I said that we have been given a bunch of ideas about how change happens that preoccupies us with strategies that are never going to work, you know? So there's an experience I didn't write about in the book that brings this up for me. I was in middle school, high school ish, and I came across the website of a white supremacist who was using the Bible to argue that black people are inferior and all this kind of stuff. And young Andre felt, my heart broke for this man. I said, "Oh my gosh, this man cannot read the Bible." And so I emailed him, and he and I started a dialogue back and forth, and we went back and forth. And as a child, I realized, man, this guy, first off, is probably enjoying this. And he will argue me till kingdom come. He will argue this point until he dies. The longer that we stay preoccupied with people who are not movable is the less time that we're doing the work that actually could, help us to build that intervention that we need, right? Like, we have work to do. We need to, if we're for instance, I'm sitting in a suburb of LA right now where a man was shot in the back by the local police department in 2020, and they're still pushing to try to get the officers fired. You know,
Mm.
in order to do that, they need to map out who makes that decision, what that person cares about, what their political situation is, and who else has influence over them, and the same thing for them, right? So that they can figure out what tactics they can use and at what time they can employ those tactics to try to pressure this city to bring accountability to those officers, right?
Mhm.
If they're sitting around arguing with people who are trying to say that the issue doesn't exist or that the killing was justified or whatever, they can't do that analytical and strategic work in order to launch that campaign to achieve their goals, And
Mhm.
so that's what I'm saying, is that some people are just so deeply entrenched in what they believe that they're probably never going to side with you or see your point because they have commitments to that thing. They don't want to see your point. And that's a
Right.
hard thing for some people to accept. There are some people out there who do not want to see your point, you know?
Right. They're not missing your point, they're ducking it.
Yes, yes. And some people are not even acting in good faith, you know, at all.
Mhm.
And since we don't need everybody, and since it's much easier and more fruitful to work with the people who, like you said, reach the people who want to be reached, that's the way to go. Otherwise, we're gonna spend all of our time on people who are not movable, and we only have so much time, right? That's what I think about a lot. It's like life is short. you
Yes.
know we don't have unlimited time, you know.
So one thing that you mentioned is, trying to fight with other people who are just kind of absolutely against equality and progress. But
Mhm.
another thing you mentioned is infighting and how that can be an obstacle
Oh,
as well. You can
yeah.
talk about that a little bit.
It's such a huge obstacle. And that's the part that really breaks my heart, is because people, these relationships do with people who are opposed to your cause, they often do deteriorate, right? And you end up building new relationships with people who share your values and who want to see the same thing in the world. But oftentimes, we don't have the resources, excuse me, and the structures to do the inner healing work that needs to happen, um, to where we can relate to one another well. Also, I feel like we have a lot of clearly articulated values around things like restoration, transformative justice, healing justice, abolition, but working out those values in practice is something that I don't see a lot of. Like, there are good examples around the country, but it's not as it's still growing. It's still solidifying. And so I've seen so much good movement work implode because people are fighting over the platform. People are fighting over the microphone. People are fighting over who gets the speaking gig and who gets to talk here and who gets to talk there. Or there's so much legitimate trauma that has been brought into the movement that is not people don't have access to, adequate treatment for it, right? And so
Right.
triggering each other, accusing one another. I've just seen so much of it implode. And it's sad on the individual level because, I think we all deserve to be healed. We all deserve healing and we deserve to live good lives. And it's sad on a movement level, on a structural level, because unity is our strength. You know,
Yes.
in nonviolent struggle, they have what they call a holy trinity of nonviolent struggle. It's unity, planning, and nonviolent discipline. And that unity part is so important. If we're fighting one another, the more that we fight one another, the more fractured that we are, the more that we're actually helping this domination system, because that's exactly what they want. They want us to be divided.
Yep, the divide and conquer, one of the oldest tricks in the book.
Absolutely.
Yes. Now, just to wrap things up, one of the things that, struck me about your book is that, some parts of them just like, okay, is this a little pessimistic? Then just like, okay, is this a little optimistic? But then you started talking about, the difference between being optimistic and being hopeful.
Absolutely.
If you can dig into that a little bit.
Yes, I believe deeply in this distinction because oftentimes in my experience, optimism is just kind of an assumption, right? It is saying everything is going to be fine, but not necessarily based on anything. Um, and pessimism can be the same way. Everything is not going to be fine just because I feel that way, right?
Mhm.
And I know that's reductionistic. There are reasons why people might have a certain temperament or whatever. But for me, hope is not a temperament. It's not some natural disposition. For me, hope is a practice. Um, it is it's a conclusion in some ways. You know, it is based on memory. It's based on understanding. It's based on knowing, how people have fought the power and won in the past.
Right.
It's based on uncertainty of knowing that we don't know the future, and so what happened before could possibly happen again if we act. It's understanding that we are the writers, or we together are the writers of the story. And when I started thinking of hope in that way, thanks to people who sent me resources on hope, I started thinking about hope as kind of a fire that we tend. And so I try to tend the flame of that by feeding my memory with stories of people fighting the power and winning all the time. That's exactly what I was doing last night before I went to bed, reading about the Quakers who took on PNC Bank and tried to get them to stop mining in the mountains. And they planned all these die-ins and different PNC banks and occupied banks and all these kinds of things until they forced PNC to stop mining in these rural areas. Those things feed my memory and remind me, that if the people did it before, we can possibly do it again, right?
Yes.
Um, but hope is also based on an understanding of our situation. It's looking at the signals in society, and seeing how the structure of political opportunities is shifting, and creating room for us to act again and create change. Like, just like, the civil rights movement didn't pop up out of nowhere. There was all of this legislation in the 1940s around segregation in the military services in the U.S.
Mhm.
that probably signaled to people the power that collective action could have, because A. Philip Randolph and others, they threatened to do a march on Washington, you know, and President Truman, I believe it was Roosevelt and Truman. Well, they were issuing executive orders to bring down segregation in military service just because we were talking about doing collective action. So I say that to say, hope also is aware. It doesn't dismiss our current political realities in order to have a positive view. It's based on facts, right? It's
Right.
based in memory.
But awesome. And again, the name of the book is All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep. Andre, I'd like to thank you for joining us at the Tiny Bookstore community to talk a little bit about your book. And I'm very reluctant to call something revolutionary, but I think that you're onto something that we're not hearing enough of
Thank you.
right now. So it's a very awesome book for the moment. I know that I learned from it, and y'all get on that list for your library because it's a wait. It is a wait.
I've heard. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
Okay.
All right, enjoy your Saturday.
You too. Have a good one.